My name is Jim Hodge, and I'm the president of the Institute for Defense and Business, or the IDB. Really very, very proud to bring you this panel today. Now, for those of you who may not be familiar with the IDB, we're a nonprofit education and research institute primarily designed to harness innovation and technology and best business practices in the private sector to help meet the evolving needs of the Department of Defense. We have a tagline, learning designed to empower change. And I think that nicely summarizes what we're all about. Now, to accomplish our mission, the IDB partners closely with the UNC system, the University of North Carolina, and the Keenan Flagler Business School. And the majority of our programs take place in Chapel Hill and the Triangle area. Our participants really come from around the globe. So with that short summary of the IDB, and on behalf of the entire staff, I welcome all to our fourth Executive Fellows panel discussion. I would like to welcome and thank the IDB Executive Fellows for their participation in this event so that they can share their insights on navigating global environments with the new Interim National Security Strategy Guidance. So today, we're very fortunate to have all 5 of IDB's Executive Fellows from this year's extraordinary cohort. I'd like to provide everybody just a little background about our Executive Fellows. This is the 16th year that the IDB has had an Executive Fellows program. And the program provides students the opportunity to benefit from the extraordinary experience and expertise of these exceptional leaders. In turn, the Fellows program provides these leaders an opportunity to give back by sharing their knowledge and their experience and wisdom. And today's panel in particular provides an opportunity for the IDB to expand their reach beyond their classrooms by sharing them in a forum that makes them available to the community at large. So before we get started, I'd like to specifically acknowledge and welcome the Governor's Club Great Decisions Group, many of whom attended and hosted our Fellows panel in 2019. And finally, I'd like to welcome and thank and introduce Lieutenant General Judy Fetter for performing the duties of panel moderator, which we all know is not a very easy task. Lieutenant General Fetter retired in 2000 in the Air Force for 35 years. Her final assignment was at the Pentagon, where she worked directly for the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, leading and managing all the responsibilities with Air Force logistics, their installations, and mission support. General Fetter was a distinguished graduate of the Air Force ROTC program at Michigan State University, and then she went on to command at all levels in the Air Force with assignments both across the United States and overseas. Following her active duty service, General Fetter works for Boeing, and she's currently an independent consultant. She's also a presidential appointee to the United States Air Force Academy Board of Directors. And interestingly, she's a former IDB Executive Fellow, and she's currently a member of our Board of Directors. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to our panel moderator, Lieutenant General Judy Fetter. Thank you, Judy.
Thank you, General Hodge, and it is such a pleasure and an honor to be here with the distinguished executive fellows for the IDB. And I trust that the audience, the participants here today have had a chance to look at the incredible bios of the 5 members here and to understand how their perspectives are going to really bring to light a lot of different areas of the interim national security strategy guidance it's really going to help us understand it better and make a direct link back to the military services. And so I am humbled to be here with my former Air Force colleague, General McDew, Mr. Mike Madden, a member of the Senior Executive Service, U.S. Navy retired, Major General Craig Crenshaw from the Marine Corps, Admiral Thad Allen, former U.S. Coast Guard Commandant, and Lieutenant General Darrell Williams from the Army. So before I start with the first question, what I would like to do is just to highlight the nature of the national security strategy, the interim guidance that we're going to talk about today. And just to recap, the National Security Strategy is a document that is signed by the president to Congress, and it communicates the executive branch's decision to the legislative branch, an intent to establish a common understanding of the strategic environment and what the administration intends with regard to national security. Usually, I think the original intent was for this document to be issued annually. It hasn't been in a number of years. And fortunately, very early in this administration, we got some interim guidance that's going to help shape the supporting documents that come from the National Security Strategy. And from the National Security Strategy, the National Defense Strategy is developed. And that is a document signed by the Secretary of Defense, and it translates the National Security Strategy into some broad guidance for planning, strategy, force posturing. And I would like to point out that some of the members of the panel here have been very closely involved with developing that National Defense Strategy in the past. And then one supporting document that comes under that, that stems from the National Defense Strategy, is the National Military Strategy, which is signed by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and it further refines that guidance specifically for the services. And this one is typically classified. So, as noted, all of our panelists here have deeply stemmed in both the services as well as the DoD level, and in some cases, experiences in the private sector since their retirement that can come to light here as we discuss this. And I do want to point out of note, Admiral Allen from the U.S. Coast Guard, former Commandant, is of course part of the Homeland Security. So we have a really broad slate of perspectives here that we can really learn from as we go through this. So let's start out with the question that kind of captures the main theme of the Interim National Security Strategy Guidance, and that is that it conveys the administration's vision that America is back, diplomacy is back, alliances are back. And so what I'd like the panelists to think about is, do you see this as a rebalance of emphasis between Department of Defense and the State Department with this vision? And, does it conflict with the stated intent to invest in upgrading the military? And so related to that, there may be a kind of a whole of government discussion then that we can have here, and how the whole of government addresses some of those complex global challenges. So may I invite General McDew maybe to kick this off with some thoughts?
So for the audience, when General Fetter says invite, she means answer the doggone question. So I accept your invitation, and I will do my best to try to answer the doggone question. First, thank you very much for trying to corral this set of cats into something that's useful. It is a very tough job to do, and thank you for doing it. Also, thank you to IDB for putting this together, and an important topic and an important time, not just for our nation, but the world history. So to get to my portion of the answer, and I think a few other people might want to chime in, a couple things up front. One, atmospherics matter. What is going on in the world, what's going on in the country matter when you start trying to decipher the intent behind a document. And then those words specifically matter. And the word back is intentional. And so if you look at those, so it signals something that this administration is saying, although they're saying to keep the military upgraded. They don't necessarily run in conflict, but there is a zero sum. And if you look at what we profess inside the departments, dime. So some might say that over the last 20 years or so, defense military has gotten a larger bite of the apple. It is clear by our budget, and has gotten a lot more of the emphasis probably in place of diplomacy. So maybe a rebalancing in level of effort, maybe a little bit of rebalancing in funding streams, but you can all do that and still keep the military on an upgraded path. But I think most of us would agree we would like stronger partners in their interagency as we go forward. Over.
Thank you, General McDew. May I invite Admiral Allen, please?
That break, was that to me, Judy? Thanks. And thanks for IDB for hosting this event. I'd just like to add on to the previous comments. I think when diplomacy is back, what we have to look at is what I would call a world of simultaneity. We're going to have competition with these large countries, especially with China, but we're also going to have to cooperate in certain areas, and we have to learn how to do both. It's not an all or nothing, or it's not a black and white or 1-2 on-off switch. And so to do that, it's going to require elements of national power that are not related to pure defense operations and defense competencies and capabilities. A good example of that is how we might want to cooperate with China regarding the Arctic and other places in the environment, but still we have issues regarding competition. And the only way you can balance that is have equal focus on diplomatic tools to cooperate while you maintain a strong defense. And I would just underscore General McDew's comments, back is the operative word.
Judy, this is Darrell, if I might, and again, thank you very much for hosting this great event, being the moderator, and thank you to my great friend, Jim Hodge, and all of IDB. And so I'm a career-long logistician, retired after 37 years, and left as director of Defense Logistics Agency. And so I wanted to just approach this issue on allies and partners sort of from a global logistics perspective and our nation's ability to project military power around the globe. And the long and short of it all is I think that logistics has always been a team sport. And our partners and allies have always been part and parcel of our ability to project that power and to defend our nation from overseas. And so from the platforms that exist in Europe to those that exist in Asia and other parts of the world, much of our ability to project that power depends upon our relationships with partners and allies. And so, yes, we may be back perhaps from a diplomatic standpoint, but all of the things that we've been able to do over the past 20 years and more has been largely a result of those relationships that we have with our partners and allies. Moving forward, I think we'll have to strengthen those, as our forces begin to redeploy from Afghanistan. And I think everyone knows we've already come out of Iraq and out of Syria. The need to be able to rapidly deploy to other areas of the world will be largely dependent upon support from our allies. And so from that perspective, yes, we're back, but absolutely critical, and I think it will continue to be.
So, and again, I'll add as well, and then certainly as the other has already stated, thanks for General Feder for hosting this and being a moderator and really trying to put us together and focus on some of the real key issues. So one of the underpinning was the rebalancing of the State Department and the DOD, the emphasis on that and being able to really work together. And are you competing? And so most of the time, I like to think that, if we have if we kind of wrap our arms around a common cause, as we define who that cause and that common cause is and what effort it is, I don't think there is a real conflict, because once you have that single focus from all the agencies, all the and departments, they home in, they galvanize around that effort. And so today we have different, I would suggest, different targets. And so that's not a single target that allows us to kind of come together and do those things where we've done in the past in terms of just coming together as a country. And the whole idea of the competition and resources. And I get that, but in the end, if we just been able to focus on what that common cause is, that's important to our nation. And you do that by having documentation or strategy that's supported by, by the nation, by the government, and by the people. So I guess I don't want to oversimplify it, but in the end, I think we just have to understand that if there is a common cause, a single focus, the rebalancing, the emphasis on the various agencies, they really just kind of come together because they recognize that we're in this whole fight together. So I guess when that is stated, my take on it is that I think we can kind of do away with some of the competition and really come together with all the agencies to deliver what the nation needs. Over.
General Feder, as I kind of go back to the first Gulf War, and we talk about diplomacy and possibly the speed of diplomacy. If you look at what General Zinni did down in the parking lot in Tampa, where he put all the trailers with the countries, you got to ask yourself, how did that happen, and why did it happen that way? And I would argue it's because military has a tendency to be mission focused and outcome focused. And so I think as we go forward from the diplomatic side of the house, we're going to need a different model to operate with than maybe the one that we've operated in the past. There is a certain element of speed in today's environment that we're going to have to readily acknowledge. And failing to do so, even on the diplomatic side, diplomacy can be slow and laboring. But at certain times, it's got to have a different response to the crisis situation as it happens. And again, when I think at that time, I'd argue that General Zinni saw that the coalition wasn't coming together fast enough. He stepped up and made that happen by the way he brought, and each one of those military liaisons that were down in his parking lot, lots of times had direct access to the political leadership in that country, and they were able to make things happen very quickly. And it's that kind of innovation, I think, that we're going to have to see going forward in order to make this whole concept work.
Thank you, Mr. Madden and panelists. And I'd like to follow up on the point that General Williams made about alliances, since part of the emphasis of the NSS, the interim NSS, is that alliances are back. And the military and the Coast Guard uniformed services have such a footprint around the world that the development and sustainment of alliances are so deeply embedded in what you all have done in your careers. And so since this highlights the deep connections that we have and that we need to have with other regions, do you see that there are specific opportunities for changes within our strategic alliance, maybe with respect to logistics? I think about things like pre-position equipment, about contracts that we have, with countries on the ground to provide support for that rapid deployment that was mentioned here. So are there things that either we could be doing more of with our alliances, or things that we could be doing to develop more alliances around the world? Over.
I don't hope it's not always going to be me first, but if I take a slant on what could we be doing a little different, I'm going to take a slightly different tack on it from this vantage point. I believe that logistically, we could ask our partners to do different things that they're more capable of. If you look at the historic nature of how we sell equipment and things to other countries, for example, we love selling fighter jets to countries. We love it. It's in our DNA, and we can't help but selling the F-16 to everybody around the world. And that might be useful. But as many of us traveled around the world, some of these countries are incapable of truly employing that weapon system. Could we not sell logistics? Could we not sell shipping? Some of these countries are really adept at shipping, have great shipping lanes available, and us tapping into their capabilities and where they're strong, vice having them join us in an area that they struggle to keep up with, might be a useful way to go forward. If you look at the Pacific region, there are many more countries in that region that have strong shipping lanes and opportunities for shipping than have the ability to take on a fighter fleet. Over.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up to General McDew's comments. If we saw what recently happened in Indonesia with the loss of their submarine and the comment on the fighter planes, a good conversation we need to have with our allies is what really constitutes what's in their national security interest and what kind of capabilities and competencies actually ensure their sovereignty and their country's viability into the future. And these international supply chains are focused on efficiency, not necessarily resiliency. And I think there's an opportunity to make our supply chains more resilient if we can get into a cooperative agreement with some of our allies. And as the general said, focus on their strengths moving forward. That's going to require some frank, unvarnished talk with some of these countries that are focused on buying bright and shiny objects rather than focusing on the functional capabilities they need to actually protect their national interest.
You know, Judy, I think one of the areas that we're already focused on, but where we can get better is in this area of looking at our various international agreements, right? And so we have a lot of international agreements, specifically on the logistics side of things around the world, but there's always a need for more. I think that another area where we can improve is, you know, some of the smaller countries, for example, may not have the capability of a United States or some of our robust allies in Europe, but sometimes they have some niche capabilities that can be of assistance, you know, in a time of need. And so I'm reminded of operations, for example, that we reestablished in Iraq in the 2014 and 15 timeframe. And one of the major requirements was for ammunition, but for weapon systems that United States doesn't use. Well, guess what? There were a lot of smaller countries who contributed to that effort because they did use that kind of ammunition. And were it not for their smaller but very significant contributions, we likely would not have been successful in many of those endeavors. And so I would say a very, very hard look at international agreements, what countries have which niche capabilities that could be used in a time of crisis. I would also say, you know, from my perspective, that there are some areas of the world that we don't have a large footprint, where perhaps it's time to take a look at establishing a better footprint in international agreements and alliances now. The sub-Saharan African continent is one place I would say. Central and South America is a place where we could probably use more infrastructure. And so those are things I think during this time that perhaps we could take a harder look at.
I think also in the end, you know, every country has their own ambitions, their own goals. And so I think in the Indo-Pacific area, they're going to be kind of watching the play between ourselves and China. And to the degree that we don't have missteps over there, we're not going to force them to align to China. So as long as we can kind of maintain the open sea lanes over there and be able to project power in that region, the allies will naturally align. But if we were to have a misstep, for example, maybe not do well with a Taiwanese intervention, for example, you can see people at that point being able to shift where they see the center of balance shifting to. And that's just something that we're going to have to watch. Over.
Yeah, I might add a useful anecdote here, and I think some of the folks that worked at Transcom will probably understand this. A few years ago, I was asked to serve on a blue ribbon panel to take a look at research in the Antarctic and how to support it. And that ultimately resulted in a major revision of the entire supply chain and how we resupply McMurdo in the South Pole. But we started first with the research requirements that were basically the equivalent of national interest that we wanted to protect. And what happened was, instead of loading a big freighter at Port Hueneme every year and taking it down there, we looked at using the liner trade to New Zealand. Duncan McNabb, a former Transcom commander, came in. We looked at the aircraft usage. We looked at overland transportation of support materials to the South Pole Station and basically completely reworked that. I think that's really a viable model. And take a look at some of these supply chains as we move forward.
Well, thank you. Anyone else? You know what strikes me here about the thoughts on alliances is that how your insight brings forward what your experiences, the responsibilities, and the position that you've had, and the different way that we can think about the emphasis on building and keeping alliances in this national security strategy. And I'd like to follow up on Mr. Madden mentioned the Indo-Pacific Theater. And you may have read recently that there was a Secretary of Defense Austin, in a recent speech in that theater, he called for the concept of integrated deterrence, which advocates for the right mix of technology and operational capability within America's forces that are strongly networked with our allies. And when I'm reading this, I thought his vision seemed to emphasize that the military's key role is in deterring adversaries using this network, a strongly linked network with allies across all domains, air, ground, space, sea, cyberspace. So how might the Secretary of Defense's vision here, as it relates to the interim national security strategy, how do you think this might change the force posture that we have around the world? You know, the basing and the emphasis of certain regions, and how, if any way, should we be sustaining this differently across the globe if our force posture changes? Over. Any panelists here have any thoughts on that?
I'm trying not to be first.
Well, I think the secretary has a huge job ahead of him right now. He's looking from 21 to 22, about a 1.6% increase in his budget. And so in that budget, he's got to pull some climate change issues, funding and climate change issues. I think you're going to see the cost of energy go up for him, and he has to be able to meet that new vision of bringing AI and networks and all of that to bear. So he's got a tough job in the current construct to be able to pull off all the different things that are being asked of him at this point. What I saw was kind of a push with special forces come into play and still kind of being the point of the spear, and that's how they'd initially enter into a country, and then using alliances to build forces after that. And so, I don't think you'll see a case of unless it's something like another Pearl Harbor. I don't think you're going to see a buildup of forces without something that was similar to the first Gulf War.
Yeah, and Judy, if I may kind of shatter a paradigm or two, and I'll probably get a little pushback. One of the things that I think we've learned over the last 20 plus years is that the nature of and the character of war has shifted to a place where we can't put geofences around a combatant commander's AOR and expect that combatant commander to solve all the problems there. They have the lead, but we've got to look at it as a global solution for some regional problems. So when you talk about force structure and basing, we can't have the Indo-Pacific region be the only place, like we did with CENTCOM for a number of years, be the only place we funnel everything to, unless we get into a fighting war at that time and then everything shifts. But up until that point, we say, how can we have capacity around the world that is flexible and nimble enough to respond to where we need it, when we need it? How can we leverage technology and our allies as well to ensure that not every answer is a person on the ground. Now, sometimes that is the answer, but not every time. And we have for many years used that as the first answer, is putting a person on the ground. So that might be what the Secretary is getting after when he talks about technology, potentially about leveraging allies. An American soldier or Marine on the ground may not be the first answer, maybe the eventual answer, but not the first answer.
I couldn't agree.
You raise a great point. Some of the threats. Go ahead, please.
Go ahead, Admiral Allen, please.
Yeah, I'm just going to say the threats we're dealing with today are fundamentally shifting. We have people that are dealing with us in a non-kinetic fashion. And there's not, as you said, you can't geofence off combatant commanders, and these things aren't restricted to a joint operating area. A lot of the threats we see today are agnostic to JOA boundaries and international boundaries. I keep thinking back to how long it's taken us to stabilize and integrate the .mil domain just for internal IT and communications. And I see the value in doing this. I also see the degree of difficulty in just getting everybody to agree how we're going to do email across a domain. But I think that should tell us where we need to go if we're going to be successful at this. And I don't think relying on set geographical boundaries, JOAs for the combatant commanders, and then functional leads is going to get it done. And that may require us to rethink supporting commanders, and also between agencies and so forth. But if we're going to do this correctly, we're going to have to integrate what we're doing, because the threats we're dealing with are agnostic to our boundaries.
Well, my take on it is that being able to identify how to go at it and address it, and how you create the right balance and do the force structure. And the force structure, you can do that. I mean, you can design on how you're going to create the allowances, how you're going to create the corporations. But I think it goes back to what General McDew talked about, is how do you get the folks who are going to man that? And we're talking now our troops, our Marines, sailors, airmen. How do you train them to now? These are the smart ones. They're the ones who understand and have appreciation of technology and how that can be used. And so I think as leaders, as we look at this new force posture and how it may be displayed or formatted, is that, do we have the right tool set? How do we train our people now to be able to prostitute that type of environment, to be and deal with it? So I think it has to take the overall approach. We can develop processes that allow us to, and techniques and tactics that allow us to do it. But how do you get those individual persons trained up and able to execute it? And so I think we have to look at the whole issue. It's not the problem or symptoms. You have to look at what's the root cause, how you get after it. And so my take again is that most things are simple, but you have to find what's the foundation that drives us to do something differently. And so once you kind of come up with that idea, then now how do you man it? And so I think it always goes back to the people, that we have folks who understand AI, who understands technology in a way that we can, exploit it when we're dealing with our adversaries.
Yeah, if I can just, that is a great answer. One of the things we have to be able to do is unshackle the brains of these young men and women at the pointy end of the spear. They know for a fact what some of the answers are. We force them to fit into our construct more often than they should. We force them to think a certain way because that's the way we're comfortable, and we're uncomfortable with sometimes the way they go at it. One of the challenges I threw at my last command before I was fired was to say, not every one of our answers needs to be a person. Why can't the answer be a machine learning tool that solves that for us? And when another combatant commander says, Darren, I need X number of C-17s to come over to my AOR, and I go, to do what? what is the effect you're trying to achieve, and let me come up with the solution. So you're right. I think General Crenshaw is absolutely right about kind of forcing our folks and training our folks to think differently, and admitting to ourselves that for a generation, we've forced them to think of everything through the lens of sand-colored and tan shades of tan.
Well, thank you. I want to follow up with General McDew talked about not every response needs to be a soldier or a Marine on the ground. And specifically, the guidance emphasizes that the military is not the answer for regional challenges in the Middle East. I mean, that's called out. And it calls for a de-escalation of regional tensions to create space for the countries within that region to solve their own problems. So let's talk about the drawdown in Afghanistan that's intended to be completed by September of this year, and look back to your experiences over the last 20 years of that footprint that we've had in Afghanistan with operations. And how do some of those experiences, how can they inform DOD and the Coast Guard to better be postured for rapid deployment and sustainment in the future, since the vision may not be that kind of long-term buildup and footprint that we saw in Afghanistan? How should we be preparing to do something different going forward?
Sir, if you don't mind, I'll dive in on that one right away. So first of all, there are a number of people on this panel, probably everybody on this panel, as well as most of the people in the listening audience that have some experience with the operations over the last 20 years that we've conducted in the Middle East. And it looks like the remaining portion of our force will be coming home before 9/11 of this year. And so you raise a great question that I think is also related to the last one that we talked about. And I think moving forward, the question is going to be, how do we maintain a presence, and how do we maintain our posture to be where we need to be when we need to be there without necessarily having physical boots on the ground? And I think a part of that strategy does have to be where you're postured from a force perspective, and they may not necessarily be in the areas of conflict. And so how do you bridge that gap? Well, a big part of that will, in fact, I think, be the technology that we just spoke about. So it doesn't just apply to the Pacific, and it won't necessarily just apply to the Middle East. The other part of that will be this ability to maintain our rapid deployment capability. And so as we become more CONUS-based to some degree, that critical relationship that exists between the services, Transcom, General McDew, now General Lyons, the Defense Logistics Agency, and our nation's apparatus to get to where we need to be as quickly as possible will become even more critical. The other part of that presence is clearly the whole of government. Because we don't have a military footprint there, doesn't mean we don't have a footprint. We have our great State Department representatives. We have the other agencies of government that have a presence in these locations that hopefully make it necessary that we won't have to use our military in that way. And so I think to directly answer your question, we have to be postured where we don't necessarily have presence. And that posture can take on many different forms, the whole of government, technology, and where we do have our forces positioned to rapidly deploy.
I had the opportunity as a board member of the Council on Foreign Relations to interview our military fellows a week or so ago. The Air Force colonel was involved, and you're going to have to help me out here. I think he was the commanding officer of a contingency response wing. And that was set up to be able to move aircraft quickly, not maybe put an entire footprint down, but at least secure an airfield so you could move logistics. We got into an extended discussion because following the Haitian earthquake, when I was Commandant, we were dealing with a country whose seaport had collapsed, and we needed a way to get a footprint in there. They established a joint task force under the US Southcom. But it actually took the Secretary of State negotiating with the government of Haiti to allow the Air Force to take control of their airspace and actually manage the landings. If my memory serves me correct, in the first 24 hours, there were 12 landings at the Port-au-Prince airport, which was the only way in and out other than a 12-hour overland thing from Santo Domingo. At the height of the airlift going into Port-au-Prince, we were at 160 aircraft a day. We also utilize the same concept to close the airspace over the Gulf and come up with a common operating picture to direct all the units that are operating out there during the oil spill. So I think there's doctrine that's evolved out there that could be applied. It's a matter of taking it and applying it to a different theater of operations and a different end you're trying to achieve. I'll let people grade my work there.
No, you're nearly genius category. During that time, I happened to be a dashing young 3-star at the time as the commander of 18th Air Force, and those were my forces that came into Port-au-Prince. One of the things we learned was that no one knew we had that capability. Well, I said fewer people knew we had that capability than we needed to have known that we had that capability. And getting back to the unshackling the young people's brains, they know it. They want to do it. We just need to let them.
Any other comments, again, related to the drawdown in Afghanistan or rapid deploying and sustainment of forces?
I will double down on what General Williams had to say, and on behalf of our State Department friends. Those of us who passed through the Middle East know for a fact the reason we were overwhelmingly military there was because we were underwhelmingly supported by the State Department. It's not because they didn't want to. It's not because they didn't have expertise. They didn't have the budget or the people to do it. And they were stretched very, very thin in that region and around the world. We have got to support their ability and other interagency partners to get more funding and more resourcing.
Yeah, I hear echoes of Secretary Gates in this conversation, and I would note that Lloyd Austin was director of the Joint Staff when we were actually having this discussion in the tank about the inadequate resourcing of the State Department and substituting defense capabilities for that. So I would just foot stomp those comments.
Yeah, and I was in the Joint Staff at the same time as the Vice Director of Strategy and Policy.
That's why we have the kind of insights that we're getting from this panel. General Williams, please.
No, someone asked a direct question of me in the chat box about whether or not the Department of Defense, one, had the capacity or should provide additional support to the State Department. And certainly out in the combatant command areas of responsibility, there is a tremendous amount of support that goes on between the two. But do we have the capacity? I would say the answer to that question is yes. And so as I go back to my time at the Defense Logistics Agency and the fact that we provide logistics for the military forces within the various regions, my thought was always, why couldn't we provide to some degree that same level of support to other governmental agencies that are also operating in those regions? You know, the economies of scale that the Department of Defense brings to that operation, the likely savings from a budgetary standpoint of view, the visibility that we would be able to offer to their operations. And so I would just say from logistical point of view, I think the capability is there. And I think the willingness is there for the two large organizations to cooperate even more closely.
Yeah, there's another paradigm at play here, and it's been happening, but probably not to scale the way it could. And that's the presence of other US agencies that are capable of dealing with partner nations and building capability and capacity. And I myself have had personal experiences with the Drug Enforcement Administration in source countries for narcotics, FBI, legal attaches, and Customs and Border Protection. You put that all together, they're really starting to get at the heart of some of the real national security problems of some of these countries, we were talking earlier about buying bright and shiny objects. In most cases, those are the kind of things that really protect the country and allow them to actually exert sovereignty. So when we're talking about utilizing state, I would say all of the interagency partners that are capable of dealing with a country team to produce outcomes in the country should be put on the table too.
Before I want to follow up on General Crenshaw and General Williams have both made reference to technology and how that's weighed in. I mean, how that's incorporated into the national security strategy. But before we leave kind of the global posturing and the regional piece, I just want to ask, and this might be specific to Admiral Allen, when we talk about China as a focal point of the strategy, and is it realistic to believe that we can prevent China from continuing to expand its footprint in contested waters, and especially given the current trajectory of budgets? And so, Admiral Allen, you've got some, I think, an interesting perspective, at least on the difference of how Coast Guard presents forces specifically to the Indo-Pacific theater and to China versus the Navy. And I'd like you to just, I'd like to pull that thread for just a little bit.
Sure. Let me also add that we have a national security cutter just deployed to the Black Sea for a presence there through the Bosphorus Straits. We recently had a national security cutter deployed to the South China Sea on freedom of navigation operations. When I talked earlier about competition versus cooperation, based on the Coast Guard mission set and what we're trying to accomplish with international partners, we have to maintain a cooperative basis with them. Despite all the things that go on with Russia and China and everything else, we actually, especially with Russia, we actually share a border in the Bering Strait, and that has to be managed in terms of maritime law enforcement and so forth. There are high seas drift net fishing violations by Chinese vessels where we have to cooperate with China if we're going to get a prosecution once we catch these vessels in the act. So having the presence of a Coast Guard cutter in the South China Sea has a much different look to it than having a gray hull there. I myself spent a lot of time in China. I actually went to the equivalent of the Coast Guard Academy, their Coast Guard Academy in Ningbo, and talked to them about how we work problems together where there's no competition involved, and it's climate, search and rescue, oil pollution, and things like that. Because that frequency already exists, you can actually use it and amplify it in another topic. And so I think having a Coast Guard cutter there is not as provocative as a gray hull. Not that we don't need gray hulls to exert the ability of rite of passage, but there certainly is a different level of cooperation between the Coast Guard counterparts in China than there is between the People's Liberation Army Navy and our Navy.
Thank you, Admiral Allen. So let's get to the technology piece, because there's so many different aspects of how technology can apply both to the national security strategy and then specifically within the services. And the interim guidance says technology revolution has promise and peril, and it cites specifically things like artificial intelligence and quantum computing. So just when you think about what you saw but while on active duty, as well as what you've seen since you've retired, how do you see DoD and Homeland Security dealing with the use of technology? Where are the leaps and bounds that are coming out from the services or from the Department of Defense, and where are the gaps? I mean, where do we really need to expect the services to be focusing on the use of technology, and how? And again, it goes back to General Williams' comments about using technology instead of having people in place. Over.
Well, I will toss this actually to General Williams, because I think his previous organization is one of the finest examples I've seen of an organization that can bridge more gaps between the services if they were allowed to. Every service wants to own their own stuff, even if someone else has a capacity to do it and can benefit the greater good. I believe the two of us, when we were both in our leadership positions, were able to cooperate more freely because somehow or another, General Williams allowed my ego to not be bruised too often, and I was able to succumb to the fact that he could do some things better than I could. Over.
Sir, thanks. And at the end, I'll send that dollar bill to you. I appreciate that very much. No, sincerely, on the whole technology front, peril versus advantage, I don't think we have a choice. It's here. Our adversaries are very, 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 very heavily involved in the use of technology, and often for nefarious purposes. I don't think we have to look any further than the recent cyber attack and challenge that we are, currently having on our energy sector, to see what the impact of what a little bit of technology can do to severely hamper a nation's internal domestic capability. There's a part in the strategy that talks about the blurring lines now between both domestic and our international security. Here's a case where the two sort of come together. But specifically in my realm, this area of artificial intelligence is one that really has taken off like a rocket ship. And it's one I think that all of the military services are investing in to some degree. I know that most of the agencies, most of the defense agencies are also heavily involved in attempting to harness the use of artificial intelligence, certainly machine learning, robotic process automation. All of those tools are currently at play. And based upon my experience, they're using them, at least in the logistics realm, to gain a better common operating picture of what capabilities a particular service or a particular agency has, not just in the United States, but around the globe. They're using it to do more in the way of predictive analytics. What capability is needed where, how do you get it? And if I were to give you a specific example of where I think it needs to go, the area of resilient logistics, I think is a great way to talk about it. That meaning that if one avenue is closed to you, potentially as part of an adversarial attack, how do you and where do you get a similar capability in near real time that does somewhat of the same thing? I would use COVID-19 as an example. We saw many of our small businesses in particular almost completely shut down, and yet they were very, very critical to the production of materials for our nation's defense. Yet there was very little real-time capability to assess the impact, short of calling them and having them report in on what their status was. So to answer your question, I think the whole issue of technology is here, and the areas of artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotic process automation are some of those capabilities that we have to harness immediately.
My take is when we start talking AI, quantum computers, and DoD, look at the investment. And could DoD do the investment alone? And my obvious answer is no. And so how do you really go after those key technologies with industry? And so how do you partner with industry to go after those things that we know in the end is going to benefit the services? And so, so I think that the bigger question is, yes, technology is here, AI is here, and we see it and is accelerating at different levels. But and there's so many advantages to it. But if you look at DoD and take it separately and try to do it on its own, because it takes a lot of money to get to where you want to go to. I mean, it's not cheap. The R&D is very expensive. And so how do you bring industry and DoD together for that, again, that common cause to really exploit the opportunities with AI? And it's there. It just, and then at the same time, how do you incentivize the industry by working with DoD to get to that end? So AI is here, technology is real. Again, how do you match those teams together to get the result, the desired results? Over.
Yeah, I think there's one other nuanced capability that people are starting to take a look at. I had a discussion a while back with a former deputy administrator of FEMA, retired Coast Guard two-star, also served in Southcom during the Haiti operations, looking at distributed ledgers to create trust and transparency, especially in supply chain. That doesn't require AI, but the way the thing is set up with trust and transparency, there's visibility of what's going on, and there has to be a certain amount of trust for it to operate. I did some work about a year ago with the folks at the New York Stock Exchange on timing of financial transactions down to the picosecond, and some of the way they were trying to manage time and make sure that everything was synchronized was to take a look at distributed ledgers, and maybe something to look at in the future.
Yeah, so I think, having been in logistics and to some degree IT over the years, the question becomes priorities for investment also. And we've all grown up and developed in each one of the services their own system, and people hold on to those systems pretty tightly. So as we go forward, the operators themselves just expect stuff to be there. They're not, they don't necessarily want to understand the how behind it. And I think that's what also hurts the ability to invest in the logistics capabilities. I asked one of my IT guys, I said, go call Amazon and tell me how I can get their interface system to be able to throw it on the top of my system, because it's very easy to use. I get great status from Amazon. It apparently can go all the way down to my phone, so the pipeline of getting information out to me isn't all that rigorous, or it doesn't require an extensive computer base to do it. And we were going down that path, and I think that's probably possible at some point in the future. But it's about the investment, and the question becomes is how can AI help us take all of these disparate systems and knit them together in a more efficient way? If you think about it today, the wholesale system is pretty blind compared to the point of use demand that's out there. We get to see when they've run out of things, like for example, down at the point of use, when they come back up to the wholesale system and ask us for something. But we should have seen that coming long before that happened, and we just don't have that kind of visibility. So I think to the extent that where the new technology, 5G, AI can help us bring together the systems in a much more strategic manner than they do today, I think we'll be better off. Over.
Thank you, especially Mr. Madden, your background in Naval Supply Command and the challenges that the military faces in trying to either not even duplicate the capability that's available in the commercial sector, but at least to adapt some of those techniques. So I think in my opinion, I think we still have a ways to go to address there are a number of gaps there. But before we go into the questions from the audience that we're getting today, I want to hit on one more point. And when our audience had provided questions up front, one person astutely noted that climate change was mentioned 14 times in the interim national security guidance, and clearly in the forefront of the mind of the administration with the president's comments at the recent climate summit. So can you talk a little bit about how you think that might affect or challenge how the services do business, how we maybe deploy and sustain those deployments, and shifting that emphasis and looking at the nature of that vis-a-vis military? Over.
At one time in my career, Judy, you might remember that Air Mobility Command was the largest offender and user of fossil fuels in the entire country, I believe. And so the challenge is, how do you get a more efficient, different type of platform to do logistics, not just gray hull and gray tail, but also in the commercial industry, because our entire apparatus right now depends upon fossil fuel industry. And that's one of the things that's going to have to be attacked. A few years ago, the services were working on it on alternative fuels, and I think it was shut down by one administration because they just didn't believe in it. And we've got to find some way to resurrect it, or there's no hope of making the large wholesale changes the DoD needs to make.
I think you also got to look at potentially how it may affect basing and training grounds. If where a lot of us, Navy and Marine Corps, are on the coast, and is that something that's going to be an issue 20 years from now? And how will it affect training grounds that we use today, as far as rising tides and things like that? I can remember early on when we kind of moved to push more technology down to individual Marines and sailors and soldiers, and then the battery requirements that came along with that, and how difficult it was to even transition to keeping batteries of the right kind and right quantity in stock, because you kind of burn through those things pretty easily. And so, even though rechargeable, but that's the other thing that you don't want to see is entire ships with or platforms with big charging stations all taking care of that requirement so that you can move forward. So I think there's a lot of things in play there. But on the massive, how do you get the big movers over, and what's that strategy to go from fossil fuels to some alternative? I don't know if I'll be the first person that will get into a battery operated airplane, but just a thought.
There is the concept of shifting from kinetic operations to network operations, and less dependence on any kind of fuel to be able to do that. It gets back to the integrated defense concept that Lloyd Austin was talking about. And I think the more we can basically use our minds rather than our brawn, we're going to put a less demand signal for fossil fuels.
I just had a conversation just recently. We started talking about the next conflict, or how do you deploy again? How do you take advantage of, again, technology, et cetera? And so, and then how do you now, when you do your exercises, you take into account the climate? And so part of that conversation dealt with, moving fuel and how heavy fuel is and how bulky it is. And so most places where you go to deploy, there's fuel there. It may not be good fuel, but so which maybe you deploy with additives instead of fuel. The whole idea of being able to not use or use solar energy. I mean, there's ways that Marines or sailors, soldiers, airmen can create this own energy. And so it goes back again to how do you start thinking differently, and to include even food. How do you, when you deploy, do you still bring in your mass amounts of food, or can you forage on where you're going? And so again, it's just a way of looking at it different. Looking at the conditions have changed, the environment has changed. So now let's start thinking in a different way and still be able to direct, and operate in a kinetic environment if required. So again, my theme has always been let's keep it simple. Let's direct it to the user. I think in the end we get where we need to go. So just a different way of looking at the possibilities. Over.
Judy, I think without question, difficult challenge and very, very hard nut to crack, this issue on fossil fuels. I mean, let's face it, most of our legacy systems require the use of fossil fuels. And to buy new systems is too important, and often to convert the systems that we currently have to an alternate form of energy is also would be extremely expensive. And so without question, it is a long-term proposition. I think each agency, each service is nibbling at it around the edges, but funding in order to, the technologies themselves are not the issues. The technologies exist. It's the funding required to convert everything you currently have to the new technologies. And so it is a challenge, it is a tough nut to crack. And we will likely be taking a very incremental approach to solving this problem over time.
Judy, did you not have a handle on this on your watch as the A4 on certifying several different airplanes to alternative fuels?
Yes, as a matter of fact, there were tests going on in the Air Force Research Lab to look at the use of alternative fuels. You know, part of it was just the availability of those fuels and the expense to make them, and then, you know, to adapt aircraft in order to accommodate them. And then, as noted, you know, as General Crenshaw mentioned, you know, that they had to be pre-positioned around the world. So there is a very, very long tail that's associated with that. And so, you know, when we think about climate change, the emphasis on it from the administration and the implications for the military, it also links into our reliance on the industrial base, because we have come to count on contractors and providers for supply, maintenance, all kinds of other kinds of mission support, both in garrison as well as deployed forward. They have certainly an impact on the use of materials and fuels that impact climate as well. So let's just talk about the industrial base for a minute and our deep reliance on it. Are we in a good place? Do we rely too much on the industrial base? Do we need to bring more things back in organically? That it's such, you know, it's so critical for military readiness overall that it requires, you know, kind of a constant vigilance to really determine what is the level of our dependence.
Yeah, I think that everybody on the screen wants to jump on that grenade because we all have scar tissue surrounding it. And I will lead with this thought. I flinch every single time someone mentions the industrial base, because when we talk to our board of directors, the 535 members of Congress, they think of the people who make things for us. You and I all know it is the people who do things for us as well. And the nation hasn't shifted to understanding how many people in the civilian and commercial industry do things on behalf of national security every single day. To walk that back, I'm not sure that's possible at this point, but acknowledging it and then saying, how do we, and I use the term, our fourth component when I was at Transcom, to acknowledge the fact that these people who do things for us ought to be thought of strategically for their protection, their ability for capacity, their ability for resilience, and all of those things. That's my opening thought. Over.
Now, I mentioned earlier that the government doesn't necessarily own the means of production to fix problems anymore. And I think we may be across the Rubicon. I think it's going to be very difficult to bring some of this stuff back into government. If you look at the conversion of fixed telecommunication systems to commercial telecommunication support, you know, if you look at the issues related to the pipeline right now is a great example of that. That's before we didn't think about homeland security and critical infrastructure, and now that it is, and I mentioned earlier Keith Alexander's comment about what constitutes a common defense anymore. I think we talked earlier about lines blurring between domestic and international. I think lines are blurring between what is the responsibility of government, what's the responsibility of the private sector, and then what is the responsibility to jointly defend this critical infrastructure and ensure common defense, domestic tranquility, and general welfare. It wasn't clear to me trying to manage the oil spill as a national incident commander where that line was at, because the government was trying to enforce accountability on BP, but the government did not have the means to cap the well. And so I had to actually kind of broker that and figure out how we were going to do it under government supervision. And it's a new paradigm we're going to have to get more comfortable with. And we're going to have to get more adept at jointly managing the resources to the best ends of the country.
Look, we have always had a dependence on the industrial base, and I think that we always will. In fact, I believe that specifically for our military forces and the ability to project power, and even development of our weapon systems, development of new critical technologies, is largely embedded in our relationship with the industrial base. And so I think that it's a very, very, very close relationship that our nation has benefited from, and one that I think will always be not just nice to have, but an absolute imperative. You know, in my dealings with and interface with the commercial base and the establishment, I've always considered them in my formations, if you will, you know, fourth squad of third platoon. You know, they are embedded in what, and if I were to be truly honest about it, they're not just fourth squad working on its own. It's really embedded in every one of our formations on some level. And so I think, you know, the closer you are to the fight, perhaps you see less of the direct impact of our commercial industrial base. But as you get closer to the operational, the strategic and the enterprise levels, you really begin to understand the power of the relationship between our commercial industrial base partners and our military. The fact is that they cover some critical capabilities often that we don't have the force structure to do. The fact is that they develop technologies that would never be developed if we depended solely upon the resources of the Department of Defense. And so again, it's certainly a relationship that has to be managed. It's one that should never cross the ethical boundaries, but it's one that is absolutely critical and indispensable to our nation's defense.
I think they're probably at the strategic level, the government has got to make some decisions on what they consider to be supply chains that must absolutely be managed, maybe inside the country. You know, whether it be, you know, how do we maintain strategic ores, for example, for titanium and other exotic metal productions. Chip manufacturing, big pharma manufacturing that's been outsourced. So what, all those things have been outsourced over a number of years. And the question is, what must absolutely come back? And then to some degree, even protecting those supply chains for the commercial world so that they can, you know, act on our behalf. I went through what used to be the old A76 studies, outsourcing studies in the military as I came up. And what I watched us do was outsource the bottom parts of our organizations because it was easy. It was the more transaction level part of our business. And when we did that, we killed our own pipelines to develop people. And so, you know, you couldn't start at the bottom and work your way up in the DoD because there wasn't really a bottom any longer to be able to do that, an entry level. I worked in the Marine Corps for 10 years with depots and depot maintenance, organic capability to fix our own equipment. And that became pretty passionate for me as I looked at the depot and arsenal structure. We have a tendency to hate them in peacetime and hang on to them during wartime. And so it's always a fight for us to be able to, in that depot community, to be able to exist in a robust enough manner. But the same thing goes on there, is once you outsource your ability to fix your own equipment at that level, you're really doing nothing but leasing your warfighting equipment. And you know, it's just a different way to look at it from my perspective. But maintain that capability also allows you to be a better consumer of the commercial world's effort on that behalf. So when you've got some of the commercial world fixing your equipment, you've got people back inside your own organization that knows what should be being done and can properly oversee that capability. So I think to some degree, we've got to maintain some capabilities inside the service just so that we can be good consumers of that service from outside from the commercial side.
You know, if I could make a second comment on it, it's obviously something I feel very passionately about. during my time at Defense Logistics Agency, we were connected with or had relationships with about 11,400 or so major suppliers and partners. And so were it not for those relationships, we could not have maintained the readiness of the Department of Defense around the globe. Yes, our agency did a wonderful job in establishing those relationships, but much of that capability was really resident in our commercial industrial base. There probably is no finer, more relevant example right now, taking it out of the military realm than looking at, Operation Warp Speed and the relationship that had to be created with research and development institutions, with agencies across the federal government, and then certainly with private industry for development of the vaccines that allow all of us, hopefully, to get back to somewhat normal lives in the not too distant future. All of that was facilitated by a robust relationship between, in this case, government and commercial industry, not just US industry, but in fact, international industry. So from where I stand, extremely important and always will be.
Your responses get at one of the questions that we got from the audience about addressing the value of military civil servants and, specifically in the depots with organic capability, interagency partners, intel community, small contractors with, presence and posture. And again, the linkage between that whole ecosystem of non-service expertise that is so integral to the overall national security apparatus that we've got and as part of our national security strategy. And so General Williams mentioned the Colonial Pipeline. We also got a question on that from someone in the audience. And so that, that ties into cybersecurity. And Admiral Allen, I know you mentioned earlier something that sounded to me like blockchain, the establishing the provenance of the entire supply chain. So the National Security Strategy Interim Guidance says we're going to elevate cybersecurity as an imperative across the government, make it a top priority. So we see what's going on with the pipeline. Do we have the right emphasis on cybersecurity as you saw it in your positions and as you see DOD and Coast Guard from where we sit now? I mean, do we have the right focus on it? Do we need to be doing more? Are there gaps that you know of that we need to address? Of course, all at the unclassified level, of course.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things, and thank you for correcting me. When I said distributed ledger, I didn't mean blockchain. I just didn't use the local vernacular when I did that, but I was referring to blockchain type technologies. Yeah, in relationship to cybersecurity, there are a couple of things. One of them is, what does the government own and what does the private sector own? And then how do we coordinate the operations between it? For the last almost 10 years now, there's been an acquisition program to put technology into the telecoms leading into the .gov network. We'll be able to automatically identify malware and redirect it and things like that. The problem is when you look at the federal acquisition regulations, which I call the sum of all market failures, our ability to get this stuff out there and get it deployed lags far behind the evolving technology, and it's a stern chase. And unfortunately, it's widening. And what's going to happen is there's going to have to be a quicker way to get this technology employed where we need it. That implicates directly the federal acquisition regulations, the CFR, the TAR, and everything else. Second to that is the competency to actually deal with an event. I had a very interesting conversation with Mike McConnell, who was a vice chairman at Booz Allen with me a few years ago. We kept talking about a cyber Pearl Harbor. And I went to him, I said, Mike, I don't think you ought to be using that in speeches anymore. He said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, Pearl Harbor shouldn't have been a surprise. And we should have been prepared for that. He said, well, what would you use? I said, I'm concerned about a cyber Desert One. And if you look at what's going on in the pipeline right now, is that a criminal investigation for the FBI? Is that Homeland Security critical infrastructure the DHS is responsible for? Is that a Title 50 mission that NSA ought to be looking at as far as government? Now they think it's criminal elements in Russia, but do we know that? And then what is Cybercon doing regarding to Title 10? And I don't think we have a proper doctrine laid out right now on how we govern these things when it happens, because every agency, in the absence of attribution, is going to assume that they have authorities that they have to be responsible for. So the question is, and this gets back to integrated deterrence that Lloyd Austin was talking about in cyber, how do you bring all those together so everybody understands what's going on at the same time without it being run out of the National Security Council with a 3,000-mile screwdriver? And that's my biggest concern right now, is actually the governance of an incident related to it. That's the reason I'm watching this thing very, very closely right now.
One of the Admiral Allen's point was well made, but the gap he articulated is the fact that the .mil, .gov, .com domains are giant chasms between them. And we don't have a proper doctrine, as he said, because there's actually proper denial that they ought to be linked in some way. We can't, as a nation, ignore the fact that a .gov failure and a .com failure and a .mil failure can cross streams, and they do every single day. And we're not willing to address the problem or attack the problem because there's too much food fighting going on across those domain structures.
Agree completely.
Anything on cybersecurity related to our confidence in the supply chain, in the understanding where all the parts came from, and do we know that we don't have parts made by adversaries that are installed in our aircraft? Is there any concern or perspective in that regard?
Well, that also gets back to the same discussion, Judy, to an extent, and I won't belabor it too much, but when I was at Transcom, we put into our contract language a level of cybersecurity to comply with a NIST standard. That was only this much, a small pebble in the ocean to try to attack the problem of who is protecting and at what level they're protecting our supply chain. And there's much more to that.
Yeah, if you look at solar winds and the linkage to Microsoft 365 and so forth, we kind of ushered these people in through the front door, and now we're having a problem trying to deal with it. We're gonna have to figure out a way to deal with these things proactively in a much more integrated way between the private sector and the government moving forward.
It is an acknowledged vulnerability, I would say, by certainly everyone in the Department of Defense and probably broadly across the government, no matter what agency you work in. In the logistics realm, most everything happens in the unclassified environment. Now, that doesn't mean that it is, completely there. Much of the data is encrypted, and there are ways of reducing our signature. But the fact remains that it is in an unclassified environment, and that it is very, very vulnerable to our adversaries. We're not the only ones who know that. And I'm sure General McDew would tell you that during his time at Transcom, and certainly at my time at DLA, we tracked the number of potential adversarial attacks that were taken against our networks on a daily basis. Talking about that much further would be classified, but suffice it to say that our adversaries understand it very closely, and they are actively taking steps to undermine the readiness of our forces. And so we're doing many, many things inside of the Department of Defense, doing everything we can to move as many of our applications to at least behind the defense firewall, moving many more of those now to the cloud as we possibly can, reducing the number of applications that are required to actually conduct your operations. And so there's much that we are doing. There's much to be done. On this issue of parts conformity, there is a lot of energy surrounding how do you identify either counterfeit or non-conforming parts. That too is a big area of study, certainly within the department. And I don't think much time goes by in any one of the services or in major supply activities where that is not a major concern. And we find parts that demonstrate why we should be concerned. And so those are the two areas I would talk about, the IT portion and then the physical non-conforming parts.
I concur. Let me add two elements, I say one element, two examples to that effort, and that is in our allies. As China has become a global dominator in technology in a lot of areas, I found personal examples. When I went over to see the African Union, their entire new headquarters and all the infrastructure had been built by China. The entire thing. As I sit on a board of a Fortune 500 company today who has a parent in the EU, they're trying to make, the parent company is trying to make decisions on how much Huawei is going to have in their infrastructure. Go back a few years ago when the Department of Defense put out a warning against a particular computer manufacturer that may have had ties back to China. It was a really holistic, horrible story, if you remember, about even saying that out loud because it impacted a state who was making those computers here in the United States. All of that factors in.
Panelists, we have 4 minutes left in our session here. So what I'd like to do is just to go around and ask for some kind of a summary, some closing comments here before we turn it back over to General Hodge. Maybe just cite for the services an opportunity or a challenge, something associated with the national security strategy as all the services and move forward. So why don't we start? Can I start with Mr. Madden on this?
Yep, as soon as I figure out how to make all the buttons work. Yeah, I mean, I think there's an opportunity out there to connect in a different way with the industrial environment, with the commercial world that isn't maybe as adversarial as our current contracting system allows, so that we can become true trading partners with the commercial industry so that we can cut out a lot of the cost of time in our ability to obtain material.
Thank you, Mr. Madden. General Crenshaw.
General Fetter, thank you. You know, I think that as we go forward, we just have to look at taking advantage and embracing technology, using AI and use it in ways that is totally different. We turn the way we do supply chain management on its side. And so, but you have to do that and recognizing there's a certain amount of risk involved with it. And so, but I think that we just can't let it just kind of go by and not grab a hold on it, because we have to remain relevant to the environment. The conditions have changed. And so unless we change with it, we do become less relevant. And so I would just see that as we go forward as a DOD, as a service, certain Marine Corps is going in that direction, is embracing it, seeing how it works and how it can benefit in your mission. And I think, again, in the end, that we get to where we want to get to and be a nation where we're still number one, doing that, leading the world and doing great stuff on the world stage. So thank you very much.
Thank you, General Crenshaw. General Williams.
Hey, thanks for being a panel member with this great panel for a wonderful discussion and phenomenal questions from the audience. In the interest of time, I will merely say I see one of our biggest challenges is cybersecurity. And so obviously the Department of Defense is moving towards a cybersecurity maturity model. has not reached full implementation. I know it'll be an incremental process. I agree with the comments of both Mike and Craig, but cybersecurity, I think, will continue to be one of our biggest challenges. And thank you again for moderating such a phenomenal panel.
Thank you, Jenna Williams. Admiral Allen?
I just finished working on a commission for the Business Executives for National Security, looking at the national response enterprise that was spotty to begin with during COVID-19, but now as we're getting our legs under us there. I'm just wondering out loud, it's just a thought that if there isn't a room, you take things like the NIST standards for cybersecurity and what it is they're trying to do with acquisition, if there isn't room for some kind of a evolution of a doctrine that includes both the public and the private sector, that everybody can agree on a set of principles and how we think about moving forward, that would be the first step for starting a new conversation that can get these things in the hands of people faster, make faster decisions than are allowed now by the current acquisition regulations and the CFR and so forth.
Thank you, Admiral Allen. And General McDew?
First, ditto, 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 ditto. And thank you very much for doing this, and thank everybody for listening to us. I want to take one more tack because the cyber is in fact the challenge of our time. Disinformation is the challenge of our time, and misinformation is the challenge of our time. Those challenges force us to change pronouns. And the people listening might not be able to say, what can I do? And the challenge I would have for the folks listening is in the I pronoun is take your experience and use it to your advantage, but leave the baggage behind. If you have been value programmed over the last 20 years of fighting global terrorism in a region of the world, that may not be the right mindset to take forward to these challenges of cyber, disinformation, misinformation, and unprotected supply chains. So how do you do that successfully? And you can then be a part of the solution going forward. Unshackle our brains, be willing to look at things differently, and you have more answers than you think you do.
Thank you, General McDew. And for all of the panelists, thank you for your tremendous insights. And I don't know about anyone else, but I learned a lot from you all today. Thank you so much. General Hodge, back to the IDB.
Thank you, Judy. I can't tell you how much I appreciate the job that everyone did. To say that this was a content-rich discussion would be an understatement. It was wonderful, and you all had tremendous insights and thoughts on our national security and how it runs up against all of these issues and problems. I mean, from the discussion of the role of diplomacy and investing in our alliances and partnerships, all through the technology revolution to cybersecurity, the list went on and on. It was a tremendous session this afternoon. So I want to thank everyone for joining us. First of all, we had a great turnout for this panel. I want to thank Zabrina and Clark and the other members of the IDB staff who helped us out so much. I certainly want to thank our executive fellows, and then also, of course, Lieutenant General Federer, who once again did a fantastic job as panel moderator. So I think we might even be a few minutes over our allotted time. Just one final thank you. I hope everyone has a great week, and we'll sign out now. Appreciate it. Thank you.